hope everyone can hear me. I'm assuming you can. If you can't, write it in the chat. I'm Professor Nancy Sinkoff. I'm the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers and Professor of Jewish Studies and History. I am so thrilled to welcome you tonight to today's final event of our fall semester, where we get to showcase the talent of our newest colleague, Dr. Michal Raucher, in conversation with journalist Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt. The title of the talk is Reproductive Authority Among Haredi Women. It is funded by the Sagner Family Foundation. I want to emphasize that we are so honored when we have endowed lectureships. They allow us to expand the kinds of talks we can do. I just want to welcome everyone tonight to what I know is going to be a great conversation, and to thank you for your support of the Bildner Center, both in your attendance this fall in these very strange times at our film festival, at our other public events, including mini courses. And I'll say a little bit more at the end about what we can look forward to in the spring. But again, this is a wonderful way to cap off what has been a fantastic fall in these very strange times. So let me introduce our speakers and tell you the ground rules. You are all muted. I'm sure you're used to it by now. This is a webinar, one way. If you have questions, you should pose them in the chat, and Avital will look at them as well as I, so that at the end of the discussion between our two guests, we can take your questions and comments. If it's comments, keep them shorter. Questions are always better. And you'll be muted then throughout, as I think you know. We are being recorded, so if you have friends or colleagues, daughters, mothers, husbands, etc., who don't get to hear it now, you'll be able to share it with them later. So let me introduce our speakers. Professor Michal Raucher is an assistant professor of Jewish studies here at Rutgers. She studies Judaism from an anthropological perspective, specializing in women and gender, reproduction, religious authority, and ethics. She actually told me that she's an ethnographer, so I like to think of her as an ethnographer. As a Fulbright Fellow, Michal has conducted ethnographic research on the reproductive ethics of Haredi Jewish women in Israel, and she has received grants from the Wenner Gren Foundation, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, and the Crown Family Foundation. And tonight's talk is in many ways a book launch, although the book came out, or she's had it in her hands. That incredible, there we see, she has conceived this book and she has birthed it. And I think it's all right that I'm using that metaphor in this context. I won't get wrapped on the knuckles for it. It's incredibly exciting. And I can tell you, for me and for our other colleagues, it's just fantastic to celebrate a new book by a young colleague. It's just, it makes it all so exciting and fructifying for all of us. So that is Michal Raucher's book. She's already embarked on a new project. She is currently conducting research on the ordination of Orthodox Jewish women, doing a comparative study between Israel and North America. And this research has been supported by the Hadassah Brandeis Institute and the American Academy of Religion. And we look forward to that project, to its fruition. And we also look forward to being together again someday. Tonight, Michal is joined by Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt, who's an Orthodox reporter and writer living in New York City. She was previously the life editor at the English Language Forward and a reporter for Haaretz. I assume the English language Haaretz. Correct me if I'm wrong. And her essay, what? I'm sorry?
For the most part.
For the most part, for the English Language Forward, for English language Haaretz. And her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Vox, and Salon, among other prestigious periodicals. Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt has taught journalism at Yeshiva University Stern College for Women, and she does pastoral work alongside her husband, Rabbi Benjamin Goldschmidt, on Manhattan's Upper East Side. So she brings her expertise as a journalist and also someone who embodies the lived experience of Orthodoxy, which of course makes this conversation even more current and lived, if you will. So I will go into my little black box, and I welcome Michal Raucher and Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for that wonderful introduction. It is such an honor to be here with the Bildner Center, with Rutgers. It is a great pleasure to be part of this faculty, and it's an honor to be sharing my work with everybody here in this Zoom and to be hosted by Rutgers. Nancy and Karen, Darcy and Hannah, the whole team at the Bildner Center, and Jenny worked so hard to put everything together, and I'm immensely grateful. Thank you. I also want to say, just before I get started, that I'm really excited to be in conversation with Avital. I've followed her work for a long time, and it feels I'm excited to hear where this conversation goes, and hopefully it's just the start of many conversations that we have together about Haredim, about women, about orthodoxy, and so this is going to be, I'm excited, and I hope you are too. I'm going to start tonight with a short reading from my book. It's just going to be a couple of paragraphs, and it's going to help give a little bit of flavor of the context into which I entered in Jerusalem in 2009. And what I feel a little reluctant to start where I'm starting, because the excerpt that I've selected is primarily about the medical community, which I don't want to prioritize the medical community. I want to prioritize, a lot of what my book does is prioritizes women's experiences. But I think it's an important place to start, because it's going to give a picture of what Haredi women are entering when they become pregnant. And it's also going to, towards the end, hopefully give a little insight into how Haredi women negotiate with this medical and rabbinic system. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Karine. Karine is one of the nurse midwives who agreed to be interviewed multiple times during my 2 years in Jerusalem. She was extremely well known among the women that I spoke to. She had received a lot of certifications and permissions from the rabbis to do the work that she does. She's Orthodox herself, though not Haredi, and she works in one of the clinics in one of the largest ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem. She's benefited from her cooperation with the rabbis, and she's also felt the response from the rabbis when she doesn't do what they want her to do. So here I'm going to start reading. When I first met Karine, it was on the eve of her annual seminar on prenatal health for Haredi women. This 3-hour event is an opportunity for her to spread her message about the importance of prenatal medical care and to sell her books. Vendors from around Jerusalem sell prenatal vitamins, distribute information about umbilical cord banking, and provide women with techniques for breastfeeding. Each year, she expects about 500 women to attend. For her seminar in 2010, Karine was looking forward to teaching about the proper timeline for prenatal tests, the importance of discussing things with one's doctor, prenatal nutrition, and postnatal contraception. She felt more confident than she had in the past because this year she was releasing her new book about postpartum depression, which she knows affects Haredi women and yet is still a taboo topic for Haredi families to discuss and acknowledge. Just 2 weeks before her event, Karine received a phone call from the Haredi leadership threatening to excommunicate her if she did not promise to avoid certain topics at the seminar. In an effort to control the medical information Haredi women would receive, the Haredi leadership told Karine to avoid discussing contraception, prenatal testing, or postpartum depression. When she told me about the rabbi's demands, Karine was frustrated, exclaiming, "They're holding these women hostage." She understood that by limiting the medical information women could receive, these rabbis were also tying the hands of the medical community. Though she resented having to spend 3 hours talking solely about nutrition, wasting this prime opportunity to talk about what she felt were more pressing issues, Karine understood that excommunication meant that Haredi women would not be permitted to access her for information, support, or help. Her clinic certifications would most likely be revoked. Karine was motivated both by her desire to provide medical care and the financial benefits she and her clinic receive. So she agreed to the restrictions and proceeded with the event as the rabbis suggested. Karine changed the program for the evening and updated her slides to reflect new topics. However, when she introduced herself and welcomed the hundreds of women who had come out on a weekday evening, Karine made a point of telling the audience that there had been some last-minute changes in the program. Although she did not say why the changes were implemented, the audience understood the subtext. During the break, dozens of women rushed to speak to Karine privately about the topics she was explicitly asked not to discuss. Karine then explained that although the Haredi leadership did not want her to discuss these topics publicly, women could come to her office to discuss them anytime. Subversively, Karine communicated her distaste for this rabbinic control and made sure women knew how to access the information they needed. So I started with that, and I'm going to invite Avital to come in and talk, but I started with that selection to give a little picture of number one, the relationship that exists between religious and medical authorities for Haredi women. The fact that there is a whole lot of information that Haredi women need and want, and they're looking for places where they can get that information. I hope that little vignette gives a picture of some of the accepted topics and the taboo topics that Haredi women have to encounter and deal with and negotiate during their pregnancies. And last, of course, is sort of what happens at the end, that women will find a way to get the information that they need and the access to medical care that they require. So yeah, I hope that gives a little picture. Avital, please.
Yes, I thought this passage really was the heart of your work. The concept of double speak, right? That is to say, a system of codes that religious women often rely on to bypass male authorities, to get around systemic power structures that are there to control access to information, in this case, to contraception, to prenatal testing, and to information about postpartum depression. And all of these sort of taboo topics are really elements of choice, right, of agency. Therefore, these are things that may directly threaten a certain status quo, right? Which is why the leadership really steps in and sort of, puts a knee on it and says, absolutely not, you're not allowed to talk about it. As a journalist in the Orthodox community, much of my work is often trying to uncover those very subversive codes with which not just women, I would say, but any sort of lay person may find themselves engaging in. And really to expose how sad it is, I think, that we have religious communities that are so afraid to deal with these issues openly. So I thought there was such a brilliant anecdote and actually has much larger implications. It's just such a great metaphor, a mashal, for bigger issues in the Orthodox community, this double speak of what is allowed and what is not allowed, and how to walk around it and find that information anyways. And I was wondering, perhaps if you could tell us, Michal, we could take a step back and you could tell us what led you to the subject of reproductive authority among Haredi women. It's so specific, right? It's such a niche. And I was wondering what intrigued you about this topic to lead you to really interrogate it.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I did not set out to talk about Haredi women's religious agency or talk about how they in particular make reproductive decisions. I was really struck with these kind of tensions that we saw in, Jewish law and Jewish practice regarding reproduction. Reproduction is on the one hand really, really important, and at the same time kind of shrouded in secrecy. There's a lack of, formal rituals having to do with pregnancy when so much of Jewish life is ritualized, and pregnancy we know is such a big deal. Reproduction is, and yet, there's a lot about post-pregnancy, like the baby that results from the pregnancy, but the pregnancy itself seems almost invisible, and yet it's a huge event for women, we know. And I had been interested from a bioethical perspective in thinking about how people make medical decisions. Who are the authorities that they discuss their decisions with? What are the family members? What are the things that they consider? What are the contexts that are relevant? And, I was doing a lot of work in bioethics at the time that was looking at this kind of descriptive context for medical decisions, and the fact that, so many things affect the way people make decisions. And I felt that there was a lot of acknowledgement of the role of religion in a less formal way. So there had been a lot of talk about, a lot of discourse in the literature about how official religious positions shape medical ethics. And I was kind of combining this sort of question with how the individual makes decisions and what reproduction looks like. I just kind of put everything together, and I pieced together this puzzle asking this question, well, how do Jewish women think about reproduction, and how are they making decisions? Are they consulting their official religious authorities, or are they doing something else? And what does reproduction mean to them? I was thinking about ritual, but I was thinking also about medical decisions. And I got to Israel in 2009, and I reconnected with some folks I had met, some people who lived in Jerusalem but had moved from America. And, I was connecting with them and talking with them about their, reproductive experiences and things like this. And one woman said to me, "You don't really want to talk to us. We're not really the interesting ones. Talk to my sister-in-law. My sister-in-law is Haredi. She's from Israel. She's gonna expand everything that you're thinking about. It's just gonna be so surprising. You're gonna find it really interesting." And she connected me with her sister-in-law, and from there it just kind of snowballed. And I did what we call snowball sampling in ethnography. Each woman connected me to somebody else who connected me to somebody else, and over time I discovered, not just this medical context. And then I started talking to medical authorities who, confirmed what women were telling me. But also I discovered the way women come to understand pregnancy, the way they learn from pregnancies, the way they see pregnancy as their opportunity for authority. And all of these things just kind of blossomed out of the data that I was collecting. So what started out as this kind of piecemeal interest in a couple of different things really resulted in this larger story about reproduction, about embodiment, about agency, about religious authority and how it's constructed, which I didn't expect to find at all. And that kind of made it so much more exciting, and also surprising.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you just noted that I found so you really captured on the sort of really hit the nail on the head was where you described the secrecy around pregnancy, and even when it's an obvious, there's a stomach in front of you, right? One sees that someone is pregnant, and yet no one kind of mentions it. And that is definitely, I have found in my experience in the Haredi community, even in America, that is the norm. And versus when I'm, in Manhattan, everyone feels they're allowed to sort of comment on, right? But in the Haredi community, it's sort of like, this is just the way of life. There's perhaps, there's this kind of conditioning, like there's nothing strange about this. This is the way life is. But at the same time, it's not really true, right? Every pregnancy is life-changing for women who go through it. It's just they're conditioned to sort of repress that, I think. And you were able to describe that in such a, I thought, very powerful way. You referred to a concept called, in your book, and you just referred to it now, as embodiment, as a source of knowledge. And I thought the concept very exciting and in a way countercultural, in a way that I had not learned of it. I think in the States, or maybe this is a very New York City sort of attitude where everyone is very sort of obsessed with getting 1, 2, 3 doctors' opinions, versus what you described in the Haredi community in Israel as a certain innate sense of authority that women develop around their bodily needs. One that you know usually happens after 2 or 3 pregnancies, right? Usually that sort of, after they go through the process, they then already understand what they need from doctors, what they don't need. They can read their own scans. They sense, whether the weight of the child is normal for them or not. I think you had a story of a woman who was pregnant with her 8th and said, no, this is just my normal size. This child is not abnormally small. So I thought that was really interesting. And I was wondering if there are any implications, any learnings from this concept, any lessons for all women, not just Haredi women, about how to sort of internalize, how to articulate that embodiment as knowledge.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So, I think what's important to understand, and you said both of them, that on the one hand, there's kind of this innate sense, and on the other hand, right, they learn it over time. And right, on the one hand, many of the things that Haredi women do as Haredi women, the rituals that they observe, are very much about their bodies, and they're about actually hiding their bodies, right, covering their bodies. And the thing that's kind of hard, that I think causes pregnancy to really bump up against this, is that during pregnancy they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's harder to hide, right? And so, right, you encounter this tension of wait a second, we're not supposed to talk about this, but I'm getting bigger. And one of the philosophers that I draw on to think about this concept of embodiment is somebody by the name of Iris Young. And she has this great essay where she talks about a pregnancy is this weird in-between time, because you don't know where your body ends and the world begins, because your body's changing so rapidly. Whereas, all of our bodies change all the time, but, bodies change is just the natural course. But the fact that, during pregnancy, it happens so rapidly and you're not sure, are you yourself? Are you somebody else? Are you both? So those concepts really helped inform the way I saw embodiment being constructed as a sense of authority for Haredi women. And so on the one hand, thinking with their bodies, and their bodies serving as a way of filtering and understanding cultural norms, is just part of what it means to be a Haredi woman. And I would say actually not just a Haredi woman, but a Haredi man as well. And I wish we would think more about embodiment more largely, more broadly outside of the Haredi world. And I can get to that in a second. But having a body and living in a body and understanding cultural norms running through one's body is part and parcel of being Haredi. And what I learned from being there. And, so for Haredi women, on the one hand, embodiment is a completely cultured, grown thing that they've grown up with. And on the other hand, the fact that embodiment becomes a sense of authority is what they learn during pregnancy. And this is both, in other words, like you said, that they learn it after 2 pregnancies, usually after 2, sometimes it was after 1, but after 2 pregnancies, they end up, the common refrain that I heard is, my rabbi's never been pregnant. My rabbi's never going to be pregnant. I've been pregnant X, Y, 6, 7, 8 times. I know that an ultrasound makes me feel calmer, or I know that giving birth at this hospital is better for me than that hospital. Those are the types of the decisions that their rabbis would like to make. So embodiment allows them to counteract the authority of their rabbis. It also allows them to push back against the medical field. And one of the things that's happening in Israel in particular, but not uniquely, is that women are bombarded with reproductive technology in Israel. Israel has one of the highest rates of fertility treatments per capita, but there's also been a lot of great scholarship on that, anthropological scholarship. There's also been a lot of really great anthropological scholarship on the extent of technological intervention in Israeli reproductive care, just in general, the number of ultrasounds, the number of prenatal tests, all of the medical interventions are just very popular in Israel. And Israeli women writ large But not just. So a lot of the anthropological literature on reproduction talks about the fact that women have to contend with the authority of doctors and the medical system, and that these things are constantly challenging a woman's own, preferences, knowledge, memories, experiences, things like that. So Haredi women are not alone in having to negotiate with and confront a medical system that often doesn't seem to appreciate their experiences. And the way that Haredi women can counteract the authority of the medical system is to refer back to their previous embodied experiences, right? To say, like, I think I called her Hannah in the book, Hannah, who has 8, so she's giving birth to her 8th child, and the doctor wants to do a C-section. She's past due, and the fetus is measuring, I think 4.2 kilo, which is kind of just beyond the threshold at which generally Israeli hospitals will allow her to give birth vaginally. And she says, no, my babies are big. They're just big. That's what, that's what's like. And she says this with so much authority that the technician is convinced, the ultrasound technician who's measuring the fetus says, okay, well, maybe the scan's wrong. I mean, so, the only way that she could push back against the medical field is by drawing on this embodied experience. But this way of knowing, this way of being is in some ways countercultural in the Haredi community, because Haredim put so much emphasis and valorize book learning so much, right? And they try to, quiet the influence of the body. Bodily influence is almost seen as counterproductive to book knowledge. And yet, at the same time, the fact that women are praised so much for their body's ability to reproduce is precisely what women draw on as saying, no, my embodied authority is actually completely consistent with Haredi norms. I'm supposed to be pregnant. This is my world right here. And so, yeah, it's kind of, it's playing both of those. I love this double speak. It's playing both of these roles. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really liked in your second chapter, you titled Books and Babies. And I thought it was such a great framing because, and I think this is true in the Haredi community beyond Israel as well, is this contrast of how men are conditioned to prioritize book knowledge while women are conditioned to prioritize babies, or in other words, embodied knowledge. This is a very important, I think, comparison, because the two are equally essential to community continuity, right? So the moment that they're that's the only way that women can attain that sort of equal playing field with the male, whatever, patriarchy, right? So that's like the sole thing that really gives them power. And I thought that was really well put. Despite, I think there have been a lot of changes in the Haredi community in Israel around, women's education and careers, and we're seeing major, I would say, a sort of a quiet revolution going on in many ways. But even so, that embodied knowledge, I think, trumps much of that to this day. One of the things that you also write about is this. You also contrast the bodily practice for women with men's ritual practice, right? You argue, you quote, that the lack of religious significance for pregnancy, the fact that there are few prayers, laws, or blessings that exist for pregnant women, by the way, which is something I was always was surprised at in my last 2 pregnancies. Where is that? But then you understand that our literature was not written by women, right? There's a little bit in the tchinas, in the prayers that were written over the centuries by women themselves, but it's very sparse. So the lack of that religious significance leaves a space for women to make this bodily practice religiously relevant and formative. Those are your words. And of course, bodily practice starts very early in our community. I think with men too, to an extent, but obviously more with women, starting with tznius, with modesty, dress codes, and then tarat mishpacha, family purity laws. And you essentially argue that just like men have their books and women have their babies, men have their rituals and women have their bodily processes, and that is their sort of ritual because that is their sort of primary role in the community, right? And I thought that was very interesting, but also sort of, I don't know, personally troubling. I recently my husband actually pointed out to me in Avital Chizhik commentary on the story of Rachel and Jacob, where she says, give me sons, she's barren, and she says, because I am dead. And he says, he sort of dismisses her for that. And the Avital Chizhik, I forgot what century, it must be 16th or 17th century, writes on this that Rachel's mistake in speaking to her husband in that way was that she assumed that children was her only role in this world, and if not, she would be dead. Really there are two roles for women according to the Torah. There is Isha and Chava. There is a person in themselves, a woman, just an Isha, and then there is Chava. Then there is the mother of all life. And Rachel didn't understand that. And I thought it was a pretty sort of progressive view, but interestingly from several centuries ago. And I wonder where that went, where that sort of sensitivity went to women's other roles in our community.
Yeah, that's so, I'm I guess pleased to hear that, but so sad that it has kind of, or I didn't see it a whole lot during my interviews. I mean, not being able to get pregnant seemed like a curse worse than anything, and I often get asked, because of the importance that women have placed on pregnancy and the way, and the community places on pregnancy, not just women, but the fact that women have come to see pregnancy as the way that they can connect religiously and connect to God, which, hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about, right, means that, a lot of people ask me, well, what does that mean for women who can't get pregnant? And, unfortunately, I think one of the problems, if I could, with that theology, is that it does kind of leave out women who can't get pregnant, and that's sad. That's sad. And yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that you speak a lot about is I thought in a very nuanced way, was around that from women's bodies are largely regulated by men, whether it is ancient rabbis, modern rabbis, male doctors, or husbands. I think you didn't talk enough about the husbands. I'm sure that was harder to access, but that's a big piece here too, right? And I think this is particularly relevant in the subject of abortion, a topic that, as you know, I'm reported on deeply in 2018. One of the fascinating things that I learned as a reporter talking to Haredi women who had to get terminations for various reasons was how for some of these women, pastoral guidance was crucial actually in their decisions in going ahead with the termination, which I thought was sort of not unexpected, but for them that was essential in their sort of emotional recovery from the trauma of it. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, share, since for those who have not read the book, a little bit about what you found regarding terminations in the community.
Sure. Yeah. So regarding terminations, I found women spoke about two kinds of terminations. One was a termination, pregnancy termination after a diagnosis of a severe fetal deformity. So in the case of fetal health or maternal health, if her health was going to be really damaged as a result of continuing the pregnancy or the birth. And they spoke about those in one kind of category. And the other category of terminations that they considered were terminations for because of financial reasons, because they couldn't afford another child. Now, the first category.
I was
yeah. I mean, and yes, it's shocking on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I'll get to in a second. Remind me if I forget. It gets at some of these changes that you mentioned earlier in the Haredi world. It's actually completely consistent with the way the Haredi community is going. So, okay, so the terminations because of fetal health or maternal health, those were precisely the ones that they would go to a rabbi for. They knew exactly which rabbi they would go to. who would give them their heter, their permission to get an abortion in that case. And they understood those terminations as allowing them to fulfill their other roles in their families, right? So a woman whose health is severely affected by the continuation of a pregnancy won't be able to care for her family, won't be able to work, right? Remember, a lot of these Israeli Haredi women are working. So, that becomes a real problem for the continuation of her family. Similarly, somebody who now is facing, caring for a child with severe disabilities, or who might really suffer psychologically because of the loss of an infant, right, who was born with severe deformities, that also could affect the way that she takes care of her family, and also, by the way, her ability to have future children. So all of these kinds of circumstances are considered as women are thinking about terminating a pregnancy. And for those, they go to a rabbi to ask so that they can kind of, yes, for spiritual guidance, but also to release them from the pressure of making that decision, right? Their authority over reproduction is partially dependent on their ability to birth babies. So, right, if they have to make a decision that challenges that says you're not going to give birth to this baby, that could counteract any of the authority they had kind of accumulated over the course of their reproductive lives. So they go to a rabbi and they understand that kind of decision as part of their hishtadlut. It's part of the efforts they have to take care of their pregnancy and to take care of their reproductive lives. And so they kind of they give the rabbi the authority and they let him make the decision. When it comes to those abortions for financial reasons, it's a lot more complicated because they know that they're not supposed to make reproductive decisions based on financial need. There's also been some great research by a colleague of mine talking about the valorization of poverty in the Haredi community. And so, the fact that, they might make a reproductive decision in order to not be in poverty would really challenge Haredi norms. And there are some social welfare organizations. I talk about one in the book called Efrat, which is in many ways an anti-abortion organization, and in other ways serves as a social net, a social welfare net for Haredi families, many of whom appeal to Efrat saying, I'm thinking about having an abortion because I can't afford another baby. And Efrat supports them in various ways financially and with gifts and things like this to help them with the baby for the first year or two of their lives. And so, those financial decisions are also understood within this particular context, and they can make reproductive decisions that way. But I think and as much as we kind of say that's so shocking and I can't believe that Haredi women are thinking about abortion for financial reasons, it's also because Haredi women are entering the workforce at a higher rate than they ever have before, because the poverty rate is 1 in 4 Haredim live below the poverty line. Something like 2/3 of Haredi children live in poverty. In Israel, that's data from when I was doing my research. I tried to keep it all, at the same time. But because of those things, financial decisions are absolutely affecting reproductive decisions. Financial circumstances are absolutely affecting reproductive decisions, whether it's contraception or pregnancy termination. Their financial context is relevant to how they're making these decisions, and that is coming out of the Haredi context as well.
It's so interesting you say that. I think, by the way, that it's not as extreme in America, but there is an element of that as well in the American Haredi community, where I'm hearing this with my Rebbitzin hat on, not as a journalist, but from within rabbis who are talking about how and other rebbitzins and Kala teachers, premarital educators, who are talking about how, you know, the young generation, I remember there was a conversation amongst rebbitzins a few weeks ago where on a chat where they were talking about the young generation, they're such snowflakes. They don't want to have as many kids as we did. You know, they're so overwhelmed, they're so weak, this and that. And it was fascinating, but like obviously the economic realities have changed in the Orthodox community, not just, you know, nationally. So I think I think these decisions about family planning, not as, you know, not always going to so extreme as termination, but even just family planning has really shifted in the last 20 years in the Orthodox Haredi, however we want to describe the community here in the States. And I'm hearing this from like Hasidic sources as well.
That's fascinating.
I'm wondering, I think I have time for one more question for me, and then we'll turn to the chat because I'm seeing a lot of great questions there too. I wanted to know from you, Michal, personally, you mentioned just now pregnancy as a connection to God. This is a spiritual experience, right? There's that beautiful Kleyakar, I think, commentary, who writes on why women must bring, according to the Torah, why women must bring a sacrifice after giving birth, right? And one of his explanation is that it is because she has sort of, after giving birth, she has sort of fallen in spiritual levels, that while she was pregnant and while she was giving birth, she was at the highest level, spiritual level one can possibly be, because she was doing something godly. She was creating, she was literally doing divine work. And then after the birth, she is kind of a mere mortal once again. So I think many Torah sources do look at pregnancy as that, when they do talk about it, which is rare, but pregnancy as this sort of really unique opportunity to relate to God. And certainly the women whom you interviewed see it that way as well. I was wondering, was there anything inspiring for you personally as you watch this unfold?
Wow, for me personally, that's hard to answer. So, yeah, so I'll say, so first of all, I had a number of women talk to me about how sad the moment of birth is, really sad, because it's the moment where, I mean, they draw on this other idea of the umbilical cord connecting them to God and to the fetus. And so when the umbilical cord is broken, their relationship to God is severed as well. And often they talk about wanting to get pregnant again so that they can feel that closeness with God, and that kind of a bond with God. And that's very powerful. You know, for me personally, one of the things, so, you know, what I think about a lot when I look at this book, which is now very exciting to hold in my hands, is the fact that I did this research from 2009 to 2011. I was married, but didn't have any kids. I received a lot of, you know, kind of fertility wishes from the women that I spoke to. And I was hearing a lot about, you know, the role of embodied experience and, you know, how they, you know, challenged authorities, and they didn't need to look at books all the time and all of these things. And I, you know, I wrote it down and I understood it on some level. And then, but I didn't kind of think about it applying to me. You know, I'm not Haredi. I thought, okay, that's a Haredi belief. That's not a me belief. That's, you know, that's okay. And I can write about this as a kind of insider, outsider, you know, I'm Jewish, but I'm not Haredi. So, okay, that's fine. But then when I was pregnant with my third, I was going to be away from my doctor for 2 or 3 months doing research. And I said, or my nurse practitioner who I was very close with, and I said to her, you know, I'm feeling very nervous about this. What if something's wrong? What if, and I've had these high risk pregnancies. So I thought, oh gosh, I'm going to be, you know, lost in the woods. And she looked at me and she said, you've done this before. You'll know when something's wrong. And she said, when something's wrong, you'll call a doctor. There are doctors all over. You're not going to the wilderness. You're just going to New York. There are doctors there. And, you know, but I left her office and like kind of chuckling to myself. And I realized, oh, that's what they've been saying this whole time. And there is perhaps some of this that extends beyond a Haredi woman's experience. You know, and we don't often, we don't think about the role our own experience should play in these kind of medical decisions. But I needed my doctor to remind me, my nurse practitioner to remind me of that. And that was really, so after that appointment, you know, I went back to all of my data and I saw it in a new light. And the book that came out, you know, just recently is therefore this kind of multi-layered both analysis of, you know, who I was when I was doing the research and the relationships that I developed with women in Israel and medical practitioners and doulas and all of these people. And it's also my analysis as I evolved in my own personal understanding of these things. And that subjectivity is absolutely part of the book as well. So yeah, it's so,
right.
So go ahead.
Yeah, that's actually your thesis, right? Is that lived experience must be taken into account in understanding these sorts of things, right? So it's meta, you know, on several levels. You really internalized it
Yeah.
in the process of the work.
Shocking.
I'm looking at a few questions here, and there are lots of great questions, very probing. Let's start with Judy, who is asking, at what point, if any, can a woman say enough is enough as far as getting pregnant repeatedly?
Yeah, this is hard. So the women that I spoke to were mostly still somewhere, all of them planned to have more children. So I spoke to them during one pregnancy, in between two pregnancies, something like this. We spoke numerous times. So none of them were at the point of saying enough is enough. One woman that I spoke to who was a social worker for Haredi women told me about her own reproductive experiences and the fact that she wished she had been able to say, you know, to cut everybody off earlier. But of course, you know, she said, what, like, I wouldn't want my, you know, 3 youngest children. Of course I want them. They're here. I love them. You know, so that's kind of it was hard for her to even say that. Instead, what the women I spoke to talked a lot about was spacing between pregnancies, and the fact that they knew how to space their pregnancies, even if, so, you know, there are medical forms of contraception that they could use, and there are non-medical forms of avoiding pregnancy, and they all knew how to do that, and they talked about deciding when to get pregnant again. Their first pregnancies were a surprise. Their second pregnancies were a surprise. But after that, they sort of talked about making the conscious decision to get pregnant again. So, you know, that's going on, definitely. I can't speak to the end point, but yeah.
That's helpful. Rosalind is asking, did you find differences among women of different Haredi groups, how they embody reproductive authority?
That's a great question. So the women I spoke to were all native-born Israelis. They were Hasidic or Lithuanian, Litvaks, as we sometimes refer to them. I did not speak to any Mizrahi or Sephardi Haredi women, so I can't speak to that. And there are some minor differences between Hasidic and Litvak women. There are a lot of differences. I have a few different kind of parts to this answer, but there are a lot of differences in the actual decisions that they make. And those decisions are different from one woman to the next and from one pregnancy to the next. In other words, sometimes they'll decide they want to get a bunch of ultrasounds, and for the next pregnancy, they'll decide they don't really want those ultrasounds. Sometimes they'll decide they want to give birth without any medical interventions, and sometimes without. What was consistent among the women I spoke to was the way that they went about making those decisions. So who they spoke to, who they didn't speak to, what information they drew on, what experiences they thought about, those kinds of things were consistent. So the method of making decisions was consistent between Hasidic and Litvak women. One important difference between Hasidic and Litvak women is that when it comes to ultrasounds, so Hasidic women told me often that their rabbis didn't want them to get ultrasounds because of this idea that you shouldn't see what's hidden, that if it's hidden, it should remain hidden. Whereas Litvak women said their rabbis didn't want them to get ultrasounds because an ultrasound might lead to an abortion. And so, you know, why do you need, if you're not going to get an abortion, why do you need an ultrasound? Of course, now you know that that's not entirely consistent logic. But yeah, so that was kind of an important difference and affected the way that they thought about ultrasound. So Hasidic women might have been less inclined to get ultrasounds because they didn't find that ideology to be challenging in any way, because it was hidden in their bodies. So that actually gave them more authority. The important difference among Haredi women, though, is women who grew up Haredi and women who didn't. So I spoke to a few, and women who had trouble getting pregnant and women who didn't. So I spoke to a few women who had trouble getting pregnant because part of what happens in snowball sampling is sometimes you get referred to a woman who doesn't quite fit the parameters of the research. But you know, she's been told about the research, she wants to participate, and you never know what you're going to learn along the way, and maybe you want to change the parameters. And at the end of the 2 years, I realized that the women that I spoke to who had trouble getting pregnant had a much different perspective about a much different relationship to their bodies and to the medical community than the women who could get pregnant without interventions. Because, and this has been documented in other works of anthropology of reproduction as well, that having trouble getting pregnant, experiencing infertility, you end up feeling extremely indebted to the medical community. You end up feeling, because they could help you get pregnant, and many women have experience a kind of mistrust of their bodies because their bodies couldn't do what they quote unquote were supposed to do. So those are kind of really critical components of my findings. So those women didn't make it into the final analysis, but that's an important distinction in this research.
Yeah, sort of tailing on that, a few people have asked whether IVF or other fertility medicine is okay in the Haredi community. Do you want to just give a brief?
Yes, the answer is just yes. I mean, very much so. There are, Haredi rabbis who have been trained extensively in the ins and outs of fertility medicine, doctors who have been courted to treat the Haredi community, organizations that work exclusively with Haredi couples to help them get pregnant using fertility treatments. So yes, absolutely.
And in the States, millions of dollars are raised within the community to pay for treatments, unlike in Israel, where treatments are government funded, I think, right, for the first 2 kids.
Yeah, for 2 or 3, something like that, yeah.
Right, so here, Bonei Olam is sort of the big nonprofit that is constantly fundraising for this effort. Bruce is asking whether female Haredi physicians play a role in the process to alter or improve the situation.
Wow. Hi, Bruce. That's a great question. Yeah, so the Haredi female physicians, that's the question about Haredi female physicians. Yeah, Haredi female physicians exist. That's number one that a lot of people are surprised about. They exist. They are sometimes, I interviewed a couple who were pushed around a little bit more by the Haredi rabbinic leadership than their male counterparts. And this, while the Haredi female physicians, similar to Karine, who I mentioned, who the passage that I read at the very beginning, for Haredi women, their female physicians, particularly the Orthodox ones or the ultra-Orthodox ones, are very much seen as insiders, as almost gatekeepers to information, as safe people that they can go to. And I think because of that, they pose more of a threat to the rabbinic leadership. And so they are encouraged to switch specialties so that they get more referrals for something else. So one woman that I speak about in my book, was trained in fertility treatments, and the rabbinic leadership said, we've got enough physicians doing fertility treatments. Why don't you go into another field? Now, if there are any doctors listening, that's like years and years of more training. So, that's not an easy ask. But the Haredi community offers a solid block of customers, and the way that Israeli medicine works, for many of these physicians, being able, getting a kind of blessing from a Haredi rabbi and a referral from a Haredi rabbi meant that they would have many more patients. So, those Haredi female physicians are inclined to cooperate so that they get more patients, and then they can give the information that they know the women need, but it often comes at a professional cost.
Fascinating. The way you described that whole power structure was very real. I really thought you really captured it very accurately. The importance of a rabbinic referral and a rabbinic stamp on someone is everything in this community. Rona is asking, what kind of treatment do Haredi women get for postpartum depression?
Oh, Rona, this is hard because, so in 2010, when I was, in the middle of this research, and it was one of the topics that Karine really wanted to talk about, and it was a very hot topic because it had been seen for so long as a taboo topic. I think partially because it's understood to be a mental illness, and mental illnesses are seen as hereditary, and therefore a woman who openly suffers from postpartum depression might have implications for her children, for her children's schools, for her children's matches, for things like that. And so women were not inclined to come forward with their experiences of postpartum depression, and there wasn't a whole lot of talk in the community about it as a result, because of the stigma associated with it. I think there might have been some changes in the last 10 years that I've heard about. I think it's becoming, more openly discussed and hopefully more accepted. But when I was doing my research, it was still, there was a lot of tension about it. So the resources were hard to find for many women, but Karine and some other nurse practitioners that I spoke to were those sources of information. They could be reached for help. And social workers for the Haredi community, who I spoke to, a number of them, they were very much aware of this problem, and they were kind of on it, right? They looked for the signs, they knew who to speak to, and because they work within the Haredi community, they knew how to keep it private, and which is good for that personal family.
Right. I mean, it should always be private, right? But yeah,
right.
One of the, I think in the last decade or so, we are seeing a lot more, it's more general sort of discussion of mental health. If you read Haredi media, there's been a big sort of shift on that. It took a long time and it's way overdue, don't get me wrong, but as most things in the Orthodox community, we're a few decades behind. So I think, and specifically postpartum is actually a big subject that's discussed in the women's magazines. Pretty much, like, I would say every few weeks there is a big article or a personal essay of a woman who's gone through it. There are many, many other things that will be censored out, including women's faces, but they will start talking about postpartum depression.
Right.
But again, but to my mind, that's part of the continuity thing, right? Like, there's an understanding that if we don't treat that, there won't be, right? There may not be children for a long time. So it's in the interest of the community to sort of, from a very utilitarian standpoint, to really take care of that.
Yeah.
Nancy's asking, Dr. Raucher speaks to the ways in which male authority over reproduction is a result of modernization and the medicalization of reproduction. In traditional pre-modern cultures, the embodied knowledge of women in reproduction was a given, like the midwife with midwife rights with women with women.
Yeah. So that's a much bigger conversation. Thanks, Nancy, for that one. But no, absolutely. And that's been documented in the medical literature as well, that kind of medicalization comes hand in hand with paternalism in the medical field. And that's both, that's not just with reproduction. That's actually consistent across various medical specialties. Reproduction has seen this heightened focus on medicalization, and that has in many ways shifted some of the balance of who's making these decisions and who's in the room and what kind of knowledge is prioritized. One of the things that Haredi women do to shift the balance back to women is they bring doulas into the room with them. Because the medical knowledge, even when you have a female physician and a female ultrasound technician, that technology, that emphasis on medicalization, on medical intervention is understood within a kind of masculine paternalistic framework, that, the technology will make decisions for you, and it will downplay any other influences. And one of the things that women have done, and women and doulas have played this role, not just for Haredi women. Doulas are labor coaches that are most often women. I think maybe a very small percentage of doula coaches are men, but most often women, and they operate not just in the Haredi world, but in all over the world. There's some great research on American doulas, and the doulas that Haredi women are bringing into the labor and delivery room with them are American women who have made Aliyah and live in Israel and cater to this community. And one of the things that they're bringing is this shifting of this room from an overly masculine, technologically centered place to a more female-centered environment. And that helps women. Just by having another woman in the room helps Haredi women push back against that intervention.
Helps them literally push. Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that your description of technology being masculine is very interesting, because it's sort of not expected. You don't expect women coming from a decidedly or anti-feminist sort of place to then sort of demand female authority in that space. So
right.
I think that's really interesting. Linda is asking, this is a great question, what kind of health education is there in the Haredi schools? We don't have much in our modern Orthodox schools either, where rabbis to make decisions for young couples, rebirth control, etc. Go ahead.
Yeah, the best, and Avital, you probably know about this too. I mean, you may know about the school. So I can answer from my piece, and then you'll answer based on the schools themselves. So I'll answer this using one of the experiences I had. I observed prenatal classes for Haredi women, a few of them during my time in Jerusalem. And in the first one, I'm sitting in this room. It's 6 or 7 weeks long. And the women in there are all well into their first pregnancies. They're 6 months, 7 months, and 8 months sometimes. And one of the first couple of weeks, the instructor was talking about, was giving them a biology lesson, basically telling them, okay, this is how you got pregnant, and this is your menstrual cycle, and this is where sperm comes from, and walking them through this whole thing. And I approached her afterwards, kind of joking, but I said, isn't it a little late for this lesson? Like, don't you think they already know this? And she looked at me very seriously and she said, they have no clue how they got pregnant. They didn't, like, they may know some of the mechanics, but they don't understand biologically why they got pregnant when they got pregnant. And this was confirmed any number of times when I was observing in ultrasound clinics, and women would come in, they've been married for a month or two. This happened numerous times. They'd come in, because their doctor referred them for an ultrasound. They weren't feeling well. The doctor referred them for an ultrasound. And the technician said, yeah, you're pregnant. And, they were shocked. How did I get pregnant? I've only been married for 2 months. And all of a sudden, this technician is forced into this lesson with them about how they got pregnant. Now, that's not unique to Haredi women. A lot of women get pregnant without knowing it. And, America, we have a terrible track record for sex ed. So, that's definitely not unique to Haredi women. But I think it just signals the gaps in their health education. But Avital, maybe you know more about what they're actually getting.
I mean, I'll say in the States, I don't know if it's that extreme from the women I speak with and interview, but certainly there is an understanding that our education from that age is not at all sufficient. So we have, there's a lot of conversation around, I would say, this sort of younger premarital educators who are talking about building curriculum that starts way before an engagement. These basics of biology should not be taught to brides on the cusp of their weddings. Obviously, this has to come much earlier. And in general, it's part of a general, I think, challenge that the community faces in dealing with sexuality and shame around bodies, and specifically girls' education, but boys' education also has its challenges around this too. So, I think everything you said was pretty accurate, and unfortunately, but I am hearing some interesting warnings of a shift of sort of younger educators and rabbis and rebbitzins who are understanding that what may have in our minds worked for previous generations will not work for ours. We have time for one more question from the audience, and 1 second, I did have one in mind. Give me 1 minute. Oh, this was an interesting question around adoption. What are community attitudes towards adoption for those who cannot have children biologically?
Yeah, I can't speak extensively to that. I'll answer in two kind of ways. So so first of all, adoption is a much longer drawn out process in Israel than my understanding is than it is in America. I don't have a great knowledge of those things, but I know when I spoke to social workers in Israel, that's what they emphasized repeatadly, that it's, it could take just 7 years until you can adopt a baby, and perhaps it also takes that long in America. I'm not sure, but that was the impression that they had. So that's kind of one piece of it. One woman who had trouble getting pregnant spoke to me about this kind of informal adoption network in the Haredi community, where sometimes babies born with disabilities would be adopted by families that were having trouble getting pregnant. I don't know, we can say a lot about that, but that was kind of one method of non-biological child rearing that I heard of in the Haredi community. I heard that also from social workers, that was often a way of helping out the family that gave birth to this child with disabilities, and also creating a family with children for a family who couldn't have. So yeah, that's kind of the extent of what I know about adoption. It's, and it's partially there's a lot of emphasis on biological connections, on genetic lineage, knowing the genetic lineage of a child. We didn't get to talk about, genetic testing that happens, but that kind of genetic identity is also really important in the Haredi community. And I think that is largely affecting attitudes towards adoption, except for in those kind of unique cases that I mentioned. Avital, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a crazy story about this. I want to say it was last year in, I think it was a Haredi reporter for Yediot Ahronot, the Israeli newspaper, wrote about another sort of informal adoption network, actually with babies that were born out of wedlock. Young Haredi girls who, were not married, got pregnant, for whatever reason did not get abortions and are sort of taken to America or somewhere else to have the child so it doesn't ruin their futures and their communities, and then they come back. And then those children are sort of given to families that cannot have children biologically. So it's also pretty uncomfortable, to say the least, but that's sort of how the community takes care of these situations from within.
Right.
Okay. Yes. If there's any summation, Michal, that you don't have to, but this is kind of the moment, and I'll make a few comments.
Yeah, well, first I want to say thank you, Avital. This was so fun, and you've done such pioneering work, and I'm excited to be in conversation with you more. I hope folks buy my book. They can, everybody can do a little, self-promotion. You can buy it on Bookshop or Amazon or Barnes and Noble. It's very affordable. And so I hope you buy. I hope, one of the things, I hope there are a lot of takeaways from the book, but a couple of them I'll just say very quickly. One is the role of embodiment in identity, in religious authority. We often think of religious authority, particularly for Jews, as book smart, and I don't think that's the case. And my book demonstrates it's not the case for women. There's absolutely a religious authority developed around embodiment. And I don't think it's the case for men either. And I just think we haven't thought about it enough. So that's number one. But the other thing that I hope people really take away from this book, in addition to the obvious of Haredi women are doing all sorts of things that you're going to be surprised about, and they're negotiating authority and medicine and religion and pushing back and all these things that are going to surprise you, is I hope people, really come to see that when folks make decisions, medical or otherwise, they're not just listening to religious authorities, that they're taking all sorts of other considerations into account, cultural, embodied, financial, familial. All of these things are affecting the way we make decisions and the way we create identities. And I hope that's a big takeaway from the book and from tonight.
So I want to, everyone in the audience, applaud, wave. Thank you so much, both of you. It was just, we had such active participation on the chat. I think we'll be able to figure out how to save the questions that weren't asked so that both of you can look at them. I do want to say that there's a paradox in your work, which is on the one hand, you've given voice to women who feel empowered during their pregnancies to use their embodied experience to challenge male authority and religious authority. At the same time, and we've seen this in Chaim Soloveitchik's very famous essay about the break in mimesis in the natural transmission of traditional culture, and the sort of bookishness that's changed every aspect of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox life, and that as a product of the break, of the rupture of modernity, and the rupture also of migration from Europe to North America. So it's quite paradoxical what's going on, and but fascinating. And I also want to say, I think so many of your insights can be shared by non-Haredi women. Any woman who's been pregnant and has had to deal with the whole gamut of medicalization of her body can relate to your book. It's been many years for me, but I certainly have been reflecting on it, listening to you, and I just enjoyed it so much. So thank you. So to our audience, I want to tell you that just like tonight, we had the great book launch from one of my colleagues. We have two, not and one more, two great programs in the spring based on new scholarship. Jeffrey Chandler, distinguished professor of Jewish studies, has a new book called Yiddish Biography of a Language, and he'll be speaking. And my colleague, Paula Tartikoff, who's the chair of the Department of Jewish Studies and is appointed in both Jewish Studies and History, has a new book, Conversion, Circumcision, and Ritual Murder in Medieval Europe. So both Professor Tartikoff and Professor Chandler will be speaking publicly on Zoominars in the spring. And we also have invited some other people. We have two visiting scholars in the spring who will be giving mini courses and online learning, as well as probably we will do some other film events. So stay tuned to the eBlast from the Bildner Center. You'll get them every week. And I want to echo Michal Raucher's thanks to our staff, particularly to Karen Small, the managing director of the Bildner Center, to Jenny Gurman, who's the senior department and center administrator, without whom really nothing would happen, to Darcy Marr, who gets the word out. And I think the fact that there are almost 200 people on this call speaks to not only the topic and your scholarship and to Avital's interventions, but to Darcy's great job at getting it out. So I wish everyone safety. We're now in the darkest period of the calendar, and we're going to start seeing the light. And I have to tell you, I think with all of us, we hope that there'll be other forms of lightness as we move forward. I look forward to seeing you on Zoom in the spring. Stay well and healthy. And thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks so much, Avital. That was so great.
Thank you, Michal. This was a real pleasure, truly.
All right. I'm going to sign off.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.